Welcome to this alternate history journey where we explored how India's struggle for freedom could have unfolded differently. Today we'll look at the big picture, a peaceful path from British rule to an independent, united India. Let's see how history might have changed. How the British came to India and changed its future forever. India was once one of the richest regions in the world. It had silk, spices, gold, and thriving kingdoms. Long before the British ever set sail for the East, India was ruled by powerful empires like the Mughals. The Mughal Empire controlled almost the entire Indian subcontinent. Their rule brought great architecture, trade, and culture. But like all empires, it started to weaken over time. Meanwhile, far away in Europe, Britain was growing in power. It was a small island, but had big ambitions. The British were trading with many parts of the world, but they wanted more. More wealth, more spices, and more control. That's when their eyes turned toward the East, especially India. The British didn't come as conquerors in the beginning, they came as traders. In the year 1600, a group of merchants in England formed the East India Company. Their goal was simple: trade goods with India and make profit. At first, they asked for permission from the Mughal rulers to set up small trading posts. The Mughals agreed because they didn't see these foreign traders as a threat. But slowly, things began to change. As the Mughal Empire became weaker, the British became stronger. The East India Company started making deals with local rulers. They promised help in wars and offered weapons and money. In return, they took land taxes and control. One of the biggest turning points was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. In this battle, the British defeated the Nawab of Bengal with the help of Indian allies who betrayed their own ruler. It was the beginning of British political power in India. After that, the East India Company began to control more regions. They didn't just trade anymore. They ruled. Indian soldiers known as sepoys worked for the company. Indian kings were forced to sign treaties. Some resisted, but most were defeated. But the Indian people were not happy under British control. There was anger, especially among the Indian soldiers. In 1857, that anger turned into a rebellion. This was the first war of independence. Thousands of Indian soldiers and civilians rose up against the British. It was a huge and violent revolt. Cities like Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow saw bloody battles. The Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was declared the symbolic leader of the revolt. For a moment, it looked like India could win back its freedom. But the British were too powerful. They brought in reinforcements and crushed the rebellion. After 1857, the East India Company was removed from power. The British government took direct control of India. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India, and the country was now ruled by the British Crown. The Mughal Empire officially ended. Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured, humiliated, and sent into exile. It was the final chapter of centuries of Mughal rule. After 1857, the British changed their strategy. They ruled India with even more control. Railways, schools, and government systems were built, but mostly to benefit British interests. They divided communities based on religion and caste. Hindus and Muslims were often turned against each other. This divide and rule policy made the British harder to fight. By the early 1900s, a new movement began. Indians started demanding freedom. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah rose up with different visions. Gandhi called for non-violent resistance. Jinnah spoke for the rights of Muslims. The freedom movement grew stronger year by year. But the British had left behind deep divisions. When independence finally came in 1947, it did not come peacefully. India was divided into two countries, India and Pakistan. The partition caused massive violence. Millions of people were forced to leave their homes. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs were all caught in the chaos. Over 1 million people died. Families were torn apart. A land that had been won for centuries was now split forever. This is how the British came to India, stayed for over 300 years, and left behind a divided subcontinent. Their journey began with trade, continued with war and politics, and ended with one of the most painful partitions in human history. What if the British had never left India? Now imagine for a moment that the British never left India in 1947. Imagine there was no independence. No partition, no borders between India and Pakistan, no tricolour flag raised at midnight. Instead, the Union Jack still flew over Delhi, Lahore, and Dhaka. The viceroy still lived in the palace, and Queen Elizabeth remained the symbolic head of the land once known as the jewel in the crown. What kind of world would that be? To understand this alternate reality, let's first think about what made the British leave in the first place. After World War II, Britain was weak. It had lost money, manpower, and power. Meanwhile, India's freedom movement had become too strong to ignore. The British had no choice but to give up control. But what if none of that had happened? Suppose the British had won World War II and stayed powerful. Suppose Indian leaders like Gandhi and Nehru had been arrested or never gained popular support. Suppose there was no Quit India movement. Suppose Britain had decided to hold India as a permanent colony. In that world, India would have remained under direct British rule in 1947 and beyond. There would have been no partition, so the entire subcontinent, from Afghanistan's border to Bengal's coast, would have remained one single British-controlled territory. No India, no Pakistan, just a vast colony ruled from London. What would daily life look like? The English language would be even more dominant than it is now. Schools and universities would follow British curriculums. History would be told from the perspective of the empire. Indian languages would slowly lose importance in official use. The civil service, police and army would be controlled by British officers. Indian soldiers would still fight under the Union Jack. Religion and community divisions would remain, and perhaps even grow. The British would continue their divide and rule policy. They would keep Hindus and Muslims apart, encouraging suspicion and fear. Without partition, communal tensions might erupt in bigger and more violent ways, but the British would keep using these tensions to stay in power, keeping the people divided so that the empire could rule more easily. Economically, India would still serve British needs. The factories would produce goods for Britain. The farmers would grow crops to feed other parts of the empire. Indian industries like textile, steel, and railways would grow, but under foreign ownership. Profits would flow to London. The average Indian might have access to better infrastructure, like rail lines and ports, but poverty would remain. The rich would get richer, and the poor would stay forgotten. Politically, there would be no Prime Minister of India, no constitution, no Lok Sabha. Instead, laws would be passed in London and enforced in Delhi. A small number of Indian elites might be given some power, but they would work under the British flag. Protests would be crushed. Free speech would be limited. Newspapers would be censored. But things could evolve. In time, perhaps by the 1960s or 70s, the British might allow more self-governance. Not full independence, but a form of controlled autonomy. India might become something like Canada or Australia, still under the British crown, but with its own local parliament. There would be a flag, a prime minister, and elections, but the Queen would still be the head of state. And what about technology? If India remained under British rule, it might have gained better access to British science and engineering. Roads, airports, and hospitals might have expanded faster. But again, who would benefit? Likely the British companies, not the common man. India's space program? Probably non-existent. Nuclear weapons? Most likely banned. Now let's think about identity. What does it mean to be Indian if your land is not your own? If your flag is foreign? If your decisions are made in another country? The idea of India, as a proud, ancient, independent civilization, would slowly fade. A whole generation would grow up without the dream of freedom, without the stories of Gandhi's Salt March or Bhagat Singh's sacrifice, without a reason to fight back. And perhaps the saddest part, the dreams of millions of poets, thinkers, revolutionaries would be left unfinished. The songs of freedom would never be sung. The names of heroes would vanish from textbooks, and the spirit of India as we know it would be something very different. This is just the beginning of the story. In the next parts, we will explore how this alternate British India would deal with modern problems, terrorism, global politics, China, America, the Cold War, and whether it could rise as a global power under the shadow of the empire. British India in the Cold War era. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the world was no longer ruled by empires, but by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun. It was not a direct war, but a silent, constant tension. a war of spies, ideology, and influence. In our real history, India became a neutral power. It stayed non-aligned, refusing to fully join either side. But in this alternate world, India is still not independent. It is still British India. What role would it play in the Cold War? Let's imagine this carefully. The British Empire is still alive, and India is its largest and most important colony. That means India would automatically follow the West. Under American and British leadership, India would be part of the Western Bloc, siding with NATO and other capitalist democracies. There would be no non-aligned movement, no independent Indian foreign policy, no Nehru, no Bandung Conference. Instead, Indian troops would be used in Western-backed conflicts. British India might send soldiers to Korea, or even to Vietnam, fighting alongside Americans. Indian soldiers under British command would wear the same uniform and fight battles not for their own country, but for the goals of the Western world. At the same time, the Soviet Union would not ignore India. It would see British India as a dangerous colony too close to Asia's heart. The USSR might fund communist rebels inside India. Naxalite movements and communist uprisings, which existed even in real history, might grow stronger, more violent and more dangerous. The British would respond with crackdowns, surveillance and police control. The Cold War inside India would become a battle of spies, rebels, and underground resistance. Now let's talk about technology and progress. Because India is still under British control, it would likely get access to Western science and technology, but only under permission. There might be modern airports, better electricity, and some industrial growth. But all major decisions, from military spending to foreign relations, would be made in London. Would India have a nuclear bomb? Most likely not. Britain would never allow a colony to have weapons of mass destruction. That means no Pokhran test, no Indian nuclear program. Pakistan, too, would never exist as a separate state. So the India-Pakistan rivalry would never happen, at least not in the same way. But this doesn't mean peace. It might just mean that violence takes a different form. Communal tensions could still exist, and British officers might continue to play communities against each other to keep control. The seeds of Hindu-Muslim conflict could be used by the British as tools to distract and divide the population. Culturally, the British influence would grow deeper. Indian cinema might never explode the way Bollywood did. Instead, it could become a smaller industry under British censorship. Political speech and artistic freedom would remain restricted. Writers, poets, and thinkers would be under watch. Some would go into exile. Others would go silent. Economically, things might look impressive from the outside. Tall buildings, highways, British companies investing in cities like Bombay and Calcutta. But the poor would remain poor. The British wouldn't prioritise rural development or poverty reduction unless it served their purpose. Indian farmers would still be growing cash crops for export. The profits would leave the country. The villages would still lack clean water, education and healthcare. Now consider the youth. Without independence, Monsieur, a whole generation of Indians would grow up under a foreign flag. They would be taught British history, British values, and British superiority. Some might believe it, others would feel lost. The dream of freedom, the pride of being Indian, would be buried under layers of control, obedience, and silence. But every fire leaves behind an ember. Even in this alternate world, voices would rise. Secret revolutionaries, underground writers, student groups, local leaders would begin to ask questions. Why are we still ruled by foreigners? Why don't we have the right to decide our future? Why is our land still not our own? These questions would not go away. In the next part of this alternate history, we'll explore what happens when those questions become demands, when the dream of freedom reignites, even under the shadow of the Cold War. The rise of a new independence movement under British rule. Time has passed. It's the late 1970s now. Over 3 decades have gone by since the end of World War II, and yet India is still under the British Crown. There is no Republic of India, no democratic constitution written by Indians, no tricolour flag flying over Red Fort. But something is changing beneath the surface. A new generation has grown up, one that never saw Gandhi, never heard the cries of independence in 1947, because in this version of history, independence never came. But stories still live. In homes, in books, in whispered conversations, the memory of what could have been is still alive. And the desire for freedom, once buried, is starting to rise again. This new generation is educated. Many have gone to British-style schools and colleges. They speak fluent English. They understand law, politics, and technology. But they also see something is deeply wrong. They see British officers still sitting in the highest offices. They see wealth leaving the country. They see their parents struggling in poverty while foreign businessmen live in luxury. And they begin to ask questions. Why are we still being ruled from London? Why do we not have the right to govern ourselves? Why are decisions about our lives made by people who have never walked our streets? This time, the movement does not begin in the villages. It begins in the cities, in universities, among young people. Writers, lawyers, professors, and activists start meeting in secret. Their demand is clear: total independence, not reforms, not partial autonomy. Real, full freedom. At first, the British ignore them. Then they laugh. Then they begin to fear. Because this movement is different. It is smart. It is organized. It is peaceful. But bold. And it spreads fast. From Delhi to Dhaka, from Lahore to Chennai, young Indians begin to march again. They carry signs. They write newspapers. They sing songs that were once banned. They quote old freedom fighters. They connect with the world through letters and broadcasts, exposing British rule to the global audience. The world has changed too. The empire is not what it once was. Britain has given up many other colonies by now: Kenya, Jamaica, Malaysia. The idea of empire is weakening. International pressure begins to build. The United Nations hears voices from India, calling for a vote for human rights, for justice. The British respond with what they know best: control. They ban newspapers, arrest leaders, send soldiers into campuses. But that only makes the movement stronger. Martyrs are born. Their names spread like wildfire. Their stories are told from rickshaw drivers to factory workers, and for the first time in decades, the people of India, from all religions, languages, and classes, begin to unite under one dream: freedom. And then something new happens. British soldiers of Indian origin and the sepoys of the modern era begin to refuse orders. Some quit. Some join the protesters. A split forms within the system. The British Empire starts to shake from the inside. This is no longer a rebellion. It is a revolution, and the leaders of the movement know they must learn from the past. They must avoid the violence of 1857, the mistakes of division in 1947. They speak of a united India. No partition, no bloodshed, a secular, democratic, modern India, free from both colonial rule and religious hatred. In this alternate timeline, the second independence movement is even more powerful than the first. It is not just about kicking out the British. It's about redefining what it means to be Indian, not a subject of the empire, but a citizen of a free, proud, and united nation. Perfect. Here's part 5 of your alternate history series, continuing in English and in a long-form speech-touch narration style ideal for voiceover: London's response and the turning point of the empire. The streets of Calcutta are no longer silent. In Bombay, students march with books in one hand and flags in the other. In Delhi, protesters fill the air with chants. In Lahore and Dhaka, the same cries echo: freedom now. The second independence movement is no longer a whisper, it is a storm. And this storm reaches all the way to London. At 10 Downing Street, the heart of the British government, ministers gather in quiet panic. They read reports of civil disobedience, economic boycotts, British-owned trains brought to a halt, and once loyal Indian officers refusing to obey. The Prime Minister knows what this means. The jewel of the empire is slipping away. But not everyone in London agrees on what to do next. Some ministers, older, more traditional, argue that India must be controlled by force. A show of power, they say, will silence the rebels, and they speak of sending more troops, declaring emergency rule, and arresting every protester. To them, India is a colony that must obey. But there are others, younger voices, more cautious, who know the world has changed. They argue that the empire is no longer unchallenged. Britain has economic troubles of its own. the Cold War demands attention elsewhere, and brutally suppressing a peaceful independence movement in India could bring international shame. Meanwhile, the media in the West begins to take notice. American and European newspapers publish headlines: India's fight for freedom resurfaces, British rule under fire in the East. Television reports show Indian children marching beside their parents. Old images of Gandhi are shown side by side with new leaders emerging from the movement. The pressure grows. Inside India, British officials struggle to maintain control. Jails overflow. Army morale dips. British officers, once powerful, now move with fear. The loyalty of Indian civil servants becomes shaky. Even in the countryside, farmers begin to chant slogans they once thought had died decades ago. But the most critical moment comes when an international summit is scheduled, and Indian representatives, still under colonial rule, are not invited. The Indian independence leaders seize this moment. They launch a peaceful hunger strike, but not in Delhi, in front of the British High Commission itself. The image of educated non-violent protesters sitting in silence in front of the symbols of empire captures the world's attention. Back in London, the Queen is briefed. The House of Commons debates the Indian question. The public is divided. Some believe it's time to let go. Others fear what will happen if India becomes independent. What if communists take control? What if India turns against the West? What if Britain loses not just a colony, but its place in the world? But behind the political theatre, one truth becomes clear. The cost of keeping India is now higher than the cost of letting it go. Economically, politically, and morally, Britain is cornered. And so, behind closed doors, a decision begins to take shape. Not yet spoken aloud, not yet written in any document, but real. The empire must prepare for a future without India. The final struggle begins. The air in London was thick with tension. The British government could no longer ignore the undeniable truth. India's demand for independence was unstoppable. But how would this historic change come about? Would it be peaceful or violent? Would the British Empire burrow gracefully, or would it cling desperately to power? In this alternate timeline, the leaders of the independence movement and the British officials both knew that the future depended on negotiation. Unlike the hurried and chaotic exit of 1947 in our history, this time the talks were deliberate, long, and cautious. On one side sat the British delegation, determined to protect the Empire's interests and maintain stability. On the other sat Indian representatives, not just politicians, but intellectuals, students, and freedom fighters united in their goal of a free, united India. The British demanded guarantees, protection of British businesses, the safety of minorities, and continued military bases on Indian soil. They feared losing influence and control entirely. The Indian leaders demanded full sovereignty, an end to all British laws, and the right to govern without interference. The talks dragged on for months. Arguments were sharp, but respect began to grow. The British realised they could not suppress the Indian spirit forever. The Indian leaders understood that compromise might be necessary to avoid chaos. Meanwhile, across India, the people watched closely. They wanted real change, not empty promises. Mass protests continued, but violence was avoided as the leadership insisted on peaceful resistance. The world watched, hopeful that this could be a model for decolonization. At last an agreement was reached, a plan for phased independence. The British Empire would gradually transfer power to Indian authorities over a 5-year period. This would allow time to build new institutions, train Indian administrators, and secure minority rights through constitutional guarantees. The news spread like wildfire. The joy was mixed with uncertainty. Some feared the British might change their minds. Others wondered if peace would last once the British finally left. This period became known as the twilight of the empire. It was a time of hope, fear, and immense change. India was no longer a colony, but was on the path to becoming a free nation, one united and stronger than ever before. was the twilight of the empire, transition and challenges. The sun was setting on the British Empire in India. The once mighty rulers began the slow process of handing over power, but this was no easy task. Decades of colonial rule had left India fragmented, its institutions weak, and its people hungry for justice and opportunity. The transition period was filled with hope and uncertainty. British officials worked alongside Indian leaders to build a government that could stand on its own. New laws were drafted, emphasizing equality, justice, and secularism. Education systems expanded to teach not only British history, but also Indian heritage and pride. However, not all challenges were political. Religious and cultural tensions simmered beneath the surface. Unlike the painful partition that had occurred in our timeline, this alternate path sought to keep India united. Leaders from Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and other communities committed to working together for a shared future. Economic reforms began. The British, wanting to maintain trade relations, invested in infrastructure, but with Indian participation and oversight. Railways, factories, and ports expanded under Indian leadership. Yet poverty and inequality remained vast hurdles. As power shifted, a new Indian civil service emerged, a blend of experienced British administrators and passionate Indian officials ready to serve their nation. The military was restructured, with Indian officers rising in ranks, symbolizing a new era of sovereignty. Public celebrations erupted across cities and villages. Flags were raised, songs were sung, and speeches were delivered in countless languages. But amid the joy was a quiet awareness. Freedom was just the beginning. The real work, nation building, had only just started. Internationally, India's peaceful transition became a beacon of hope. Newly independent countries watched closely, inspired by a model where colonialism ended not with chaos, but with cooperation and unity. Sure, here's a concise but powerful final summary script in English to wrap up your alternate history series, ideal for a strong voiceover ending. Alternate History of India. A New Dawn. India's story in this alternate timeline is one of resilience, unity, and peaceful transformation. From the moment the British first arrived, through decades of struggle, rebellion, and negotiation, India never gave up its dream of freedom. Unlike the harsh conflicts and violent partition of our known history, this India achieved independence through dialogue and cooperation. The British Empire, recognizing the unstoppable will of the Indian people, chose to transfer power gradually, allowing a stable and united nation to emerge. India's independence was not just political. It was a rebirth of culture, identity, and hope. Diverse communities came together to build a country based on justice, equality, and progress. Challenges remained, saw poverty, inequality, and the task of modernization, but India faced these with determination and vision. Its leaders worked tirelessly to unite the nation's vast peoples and resources, setting India on a path to become a global force for peace and development. This alternate history reminds us that the course of events is never fixed. With courage, wisdom, and unity, nations can change their destiny. The story of India's peaceful rise from colony to free nation stands as a timeless example of hope for all peoples striving for freedom. And so, this is the story of what might have been, a history rewritten not by war, but by the power of dialogue and the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for joining this journey through an alternate India. Remember, history is shaped by choices, and sometimes a different choice can change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating alternate histories. Until next time, keep wondering, keep learning.